This is week 11, chapter 10 on local government. First question is what are the types of local government and what functions do they serve? Well, essentially, you can divide governments into two types, um, general purpose governments and single purpose governments. And what you see here on the left with types, cities, counties, and towns, villages, and boroughs are all general purpose governments. That is, they provide a wide number of functions. Well, you can look in the book on what these are, but essentially the functions have to do with things like policing, providing the fire department, and so on. Those are general purpose. And then the last one is special districts. And special districts are single purpose governments. They're kind of unusual, but they're common at the local level. So you have something like a airport district that runs or is responsible for just one thing, the airport, or you have a library district which is responsible for just a library in a particular city or county or town, and the most common type, which is education. So you have school districts. Second question is, what are the basic characteristics of county government? Well, I listed some here. Number one is they're a general purpose government. I mentioned that already. They're universal. That is, they're found everywhere in the whole United States. Every state has counties. They're in control of the jurisdiction outside a municipal area. So when we talk about a municipal area, we're talking about a city, county, or town, and those areas that are not part of city, counties, and towns, usually called unincorporated areas, are then handled by the county. The county government runs it. So, for example, where I live is right outside the city of Santa Fe, right outside the city limits. And so we're provided for by police department, fire, and so on, all done by the county. The third thing here is they administer court systems, no matter where they are. Like, for example, in Cook County, you don't really have any unincorporated areas there anymore. Almost every place I can think of is handled by some kind of municipality. So, so what do they do? What's the function of Cook County? Essentially, it is to run the jails and everything associated with the jails, and that's a big deal because we call it jail because people are only there for temporary time, which may be years with some people, unfortunately, but it's a temporary situation. And if they have to be sent off to jail, then they're sent somewhere else. But county jail is usually designated like you send people to prisons, and we got prisons like in Joliet, where I'm sure you're familiar with. So they have to administer the jail, and that would be hiring all the people who are involved in that process. And if you've got thousands of people coming through every day, as you do in a big place like Cook County or Chicago, then the jails are a big deal. And there's also two other things related to that, and anything like the courts. People have to go to court before they're sent to jail. So all the courts are administered by the county. Probation, if people are put on probation rather than sent to prison, that's handled by the county. And prosecuting in the first place, that is deciding to take a case to court, is done by county attorneys, the district attorneys in the state. So those are all administering of the court system kinds of functions that the county performs. Another thing that the county does is keep the records. So whether it's records about the people who live there, or records about elections, or um, who has licenses, and so on and so forth. All of those things are kept by the county. So when you talk about licenses, it's not just like uh, licenses to drive, but licenses for everything else, like being a lawyer or a doctor or something else. Those records are all kept by the county. And it's run by a commission form of government. That's another characteristic that is usually, although it's not the case in Cook County, usually there's no executive. It's just a group of legislators who run it, much like the way city councils are run, without a mayor or a manager. That's called a commission form. And so that's essentially what is done at the county level. Again, like I said, it's kind of different in Illinois, and the reason it is because when they put in the current constitution in the state of Illinois, they made it so if you had, that is, a county had a executive at the head, they got more money. So you see almost all the counties in Illinois with a leader, but that's, executive leader, but that's not typical of the rest of the country. Number 3 is, what's a special district and how does it differ from other forms of local government? I mentioned that in the beginning, and I'll talk a little bit more about it here. They're independent. That is to say, a special district is an independent agency. It's a special purpose government, and it's a governmental unit that operates separately from the general purpose governments. So what you have is a government for one function, and it could be even a kind of really minor thing. Actually, you have special districts for everything, whether it's airports or libraries or schools or whatever it is. You have a whole host of them, thousands of them actually, and they're independent, meaning essentially that they can raise and spend their own money. So they raise their own money, they tax the public on their own, and they spend that money without influence from the general purpose governments, counties, cities, towns. They're run by elected officials. Everybody who is in these special districts, in general, there's some exceptions to this. This is one of the problems of generalizing at the state and local level. I'm sure you can go somewhere in the United States, in the 50 states, and find differences here, especially since there's counties at all levels, or special districts, I should say, at all levels. So they're run by elected officials, and they use the commission form. That is to say, there's no executive at the top of the system. So those are some of the basic things about special districts. You'll find them for everything. One of my favorite ones, the one that's really interesting to me anyway, is the special district in Chicago that was designed to build the stadium for the White Sox. Way back in the 1980s, the White Sox threatened to leave Chicago and go to Florida. I forget what city in Florida, but they were going to go to someplace in Florida. This is long before Florida had any major league teams there. And so they threatened to leave unless the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois built them a new stadium. Now, that's a tough thing to do, and you don't see it happen very much anymore, where a state and local government decides to build a stadium for a team, because after all, teams are usually owned by rich people, especially in this day and age. Maybe if you went back to the 1950s or 40s, they weren't so rich, but now they're like billionaires that own teams, because teams are so expensive. And so anyway, the city of Chicago and the governor both happen to be people who were from the south side of Chicago, who really grew up as White Sox fans and did not want to see the White Sox leave Chicago. But so the governor, who was Thompson at the time, and the mayor, who was Daley, the second mayor Daley, they didn't want to see him leave, so they decided to build him a stadium. But they couldn't do it in just using the general purpose governments, because the public would have really raised a big hassle about it, because that's money that could have gone to roads and roads and schools and all the rest of the kind of things that we need money for, instead of giving it to a baseball team. Seems pretty trivial. So what they do, they set up a special district, and the district then proceeded to build the park, and the public really kind of didn't even understand or know about it. And that's kind of the process of special districts. So the question here is, the last question is, why is there so many local governments, 86,000 in the United States? And the answer to that is because there's so many special districts. And how come we form special districts all the time? Well, I gave you just an example of what happened in Illinois back in the 80s when the White Sox threatened to leave town. That this was a way to do it. This was a way to build a stadium without the public harassing the governor and the mayor of Chicago. So you have special districts. These are some of the reasons. You have special districts that cover every type of function. So no matter what it is, any kind of function you can find for local government, you'll find a special district running it. Even something, like I said, there are even trivial things like there's mosquito abatement districts in Illinois. I don't know how many places have governments just to kill mosquitoes, but Illinois does. And some of the reasons why we pick these special districts is a need to deflect new taxes. As I said before, one of the things that politicians these days in the 21st century want to avoid is new taxes. If you can remember back to when President Bush, the first President Bush, ran for office, he really got in a lot of trouble because he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And that became a kind of mantra for the opposition, that is the Clinton campaign, to just beat him up. And ever since then, every politician has said, you want to beat somebody incumbent, just point out the taxes they raised. And so everybody just wants to make sure they don't raise taxes. So that's one of the things you could do. It's a need to deflect new taxes. Nobody wants new taxes on their watch. So special districts can form the tax without the public really blaming it on existing public officials in the general purpose governments. So you have, like the example I gave you of that commission for the White Sox ballpark, and you could look this up if you want. And so they formulate the tax, and most people, because it's a special district and it's hidden away, and nobody's paying any attention to it, that in effect it's a new tax that gets by without scrutiny. And of course, you don't blame it on Mayor Daley or Governor Thompson at the time. Another thing is a way to distribute the tax burden. So if you go to, like for example, another example of that would be if you look at the RTA, the Regional Transportation Authority, what they did with the reason they developed that in the first place was, and that goes back to about that same time as they built that stadium, is that the cost of the RTA, the Transportation Authority in Chicago, was becoming so expensive, and the city was unable to afford it. So they in essence decided to build this regional transportation authority for the purpose of distributing the tax burden. And they put in addition to the county of Cook, they put in all the surrounding areas. I think there's 6 counties or 7 counties, I don't remember anymore, surrounding Cook, that were added to it, even though they had nothing really to do with the RTA. Now, eventually, over time, they started to put uh, buses and not trains, but buses into those areas to satisfy some of the criticism that the public was making in places like Joliet and wherever, I forget where the other names of the other counties, but all these places where they were getting the tax burden and not receiving any public transportation out of it. But it was really done to distribute the tax burden to a larger audience so that the city um, constituents didn't have to pay so much. That was really the whole process of it. Another thing is a lack of public scrutiny, which I've mentioned a couple of times here, that the public is unaware of these special districts. And that's because they really don't get any attention. There's the next thing, there's little media attention. Um, if the media doesn't cover something, the public doesn't know about it. And they're not going to the library or someplace to figure it out. They're just, they know what they're told. They know what they read, and that's all. I remember people saying that back in the time when I was a kid. I only know what I read in the paper. And if the paper is not going to cover it, you're not going to know it. And the television isn't going to cover it, you're not going to know it, and so on. And so that's the whole problem. And so we just keep doing this. We keep creating special districts every time we want to deflect new taxes, distribute the burden of of who's paying for this stuff. I hope that was helpful.